But closer to home, I'm talking about infrastructure tonight, and I'm specifically wanting to address some of the infrastructure deficit that we here in Toronto and across the province are experiencing. And I've got Andy Manahan, who's the director of the RCCAO, on the line, joining us live this Saturday night. And RCCAO, for your information, stands for Residents and Civil Construction Alliance of Ontario. Andy, welcome to News Talk 1010.
Hey again.
Thank you for joining us. Now, before I begin our conversation, I'm going to play a clip from that video that's on your website, and just a bit of it, and then we'll go from there.
Okay.
Our public buildings have deteriorated because of a lack of maintenance. Bridges are unsafe. Hospitals are crowded. It's taking longer and longer for people to commute, for goods to be delivered, for food to arrive in the grocery store. How did we get like this?
Okay, Andy, let's just so the listeners understand, this is a video of someone 50 years down the road looking back.
Yes.
And I think for a lot of the listeners, certainly, a lot of the scenarios that were brought up there are taking place today.
The video was a bit of a dramatic attempt through social media to show that if there is underinvestment in infrastructure, there will be problems, things like water supply and crumbling infrastructure. Everyone in Toronto, of course, knows about the Gardiner and chunks falling off it. So, although it was dramatic, it was trying to tell the decision makers, the politicians, that let's keep focused on this. We need long-term plans and we need predictable investment so that we can keep our infrastructure under good repair.
And frankly, the storm on Monday, which a lot of people like to say it's a 1 in 50 years, it really brought a lot of these things, to the forefront. For example, the rolling blackouts.
Yes.
A lot of stores were operating on backup generators. Many had to close.
And there were a lot of losses because of that, in terms of, rotten food at restaurants and all sorts of things of that nature.
So I think, and this is one of the reasons why I followed RCCAO for a long time, because I think infrastructure is important. But this is why I thought tonight would be a good time for us to have this conversation. So first of all, tell us a little bit about RCCAO.
Okay. Our organization is a labor management construction group that brings together both contractors that are involved with road building, transit construction, sewer and water mains, as well as bridge building. And
your membership is composed of both management side, the entrepreneurs who build the roads, and also the labor side, because I guess you guys thought it would be a good idea to ensure that you have a coherent voice.
Correct.
Providing constructive information to government.
Some of the major construction unions that are based in this region are part of our group. So when we do go down to Queen's Park and talk with the politicians, we can always present, the benefits of the jobs figures that come along with the infrastructure investment, in addition to the purpose of city building and making our infrastructure more resilient when we do have these severe, maybe not 1 in 50 anymore, it's probably 1 every few years.
Exactly. And so your organization was created in 2005, and what traction have you had with government? Because as we here in the city have watched the discussion about LRT subways, it's just talk, and not a lot of action. So how are you helping to move government forward in terms of decision-making and action?
Well, I think 10 to 15 years ago, infrastructure wasn't on certainly everyone's tongue, politicians included. I think nowadays there is much more recognition about the importance of infrastructure, not only to the economy, but to the environment that we live in. So when we do have floods like we did earlier this week, and of course the big one before that in terms of the intensity was Hurricane Hazel in 1954, what we learned from that event is that you don't want to put houses in the floodplains or the valleys because they're going to get washed away. So with the growing population that we have in this region, we want to make sure that we're accommodating people and that it is safe for them to live. And I guess one of the things I was contemplating before we started the conversation is that there's all sorts of policy trade-offs. So, for example, in 2006, the province of Ontario brought forward what they call the Places to Grow legislation, which said we're going to have more intensification. So what that meant was we'll have more development within the urban envelope so that we can help preserve green space elsewhere. So let's say in the 60s, where an average building lot for a house used to be 50 feet frontage, nowadays, you know, for a low-rise type housing would be 40 feet. So what that means is there's smaller yards, and so when you do have a heavy rainfall, there's less space for absorption. So to counter that, then developers are required, for example, to put in stormwater ponds. So you've got these situations where, you know, you want to, you know, have more people living in a smaller area because you don't want to pave over all the farmland, but that has repercussions with respect to where the water goes during these intense events.
So, Andy, from your perspective, how did the city do on Monday?
Well, I think there's some lessons to be learned in terms of emergency preparedness. I mean, a GO train driving into a lot of water is probably not something that's a good idea. But let's face it, you know, in these chaotic situations, not everything is going to run perfectly, but I think from the sounds of it, City of Toronto and other municipalities in this region are carefully evaluating what the emergency personnel should be doing and how things kind of roll out.
As a professional in this area, and when we talk about infrastructure, could you just list some of the things that fall under that category? Please. So we're talking
Sure.
sewers, we're talking pipes, we're talking the roads, obviously, tracks.
Well, of course, there's the you know, energy type infrastructure, so the grid system, and that was part of the problem that you mentioned earlier with the rolling brownouts. So there's a long list. It could be airports, port infrastructure, so where ships come in, rail infrastructure, bridges, roads, transit. So that's kind of the core infrastructure. If you go out beyond that, it could be institutional type buildings, sports facilities, that sort of thing. So
okay.
It encompasses almost everything.
Okay. So first of all, I just want to ask the listeners to please call in at any time during our conversation. My number here is 416-872-1010. If you want to join the conversation, I'd certainly like to hear your perspective. Of course, you can also text me at 71010, or I could be reached through your cell phone at Star Talk. That's star 8255. Now, Andy, from your perspective, what surprised you the most about how the infrastructure in the city handled the event, the weather event on Monday?
There's so many facets to this. I just think
you've got a minute before I have to go to traffic, so
okay.
Let's hear them.
Well, I think we need to do a lot of little things, but there's the bigger infrastructure as well. So, for example, we do need to build more resilient infrastructure. It can't be bulletproofed, of course, but let me just give you one example. In New York City, I'd heard a number of years ago that Mayor Bloomberg said that with climate change, there's going to be rising sea levels, and we need to raise the seawalls. Well, there was some pushback on that because a number of the seawalls were heritage in nature, and he said, we got to cut through this. Sometimes the process overwhelms us. So I think, in terms of building in the City of Toronto, we have to say, if certain things need to be done, we have to figure it out without elongated planning processes to make sure that we're dotting every single T. We just have to get on with it sometimes and build the infrastructure.
Okay, so in 5 seconds, tell me what would be the first thing.
Well, a long-term, predictable funding approach would be very good to ensure that infrastructure is built on a timely basis. We can't do it on a project-by-project basis, and we've seen that with transportation and transit projects. It has to be predictable.
Okay, Andy, I'm going to ask you to stay on the line. I have to go to traffic, and then I'd like to hear more specific than just a general statement on what we need to do.
Sure.
Okay, but first it's 7:45, and time to check your drive with News Talk 1010 Time Saver Traffic.
Conditions improving on the east end westbound 401, and last check, no major delays to speak of. Everything moving at its limits. Just minor stuff on the northbound DVP ramp to the eastbound 401. It's reduced to a single lane. The southbound side of the 404, just over the 401, you're going to find some volume slowdowns. As well on the eastbound Gardner, things improving. Just from the Spadina off-ramp, some usual Saturday evening rhetoric happening there. Lakeshore in either direction remains closed between BC Drive and Strawn. Also on the eastbound QEW, got word of a disabled vehicle off to the shoulder on the underpass of the 427. Bit of a visual distraction for you. Westbound on Finch, west of Midland, it's closed now for an accident investigation following that collision there. It's also on St. Clair, also continues from Winona through to Christie, all closed across St. Clair as well. Mini's not normal sales event. Lease your iconic Mini Cooper from just $248 monthly at 1.9% for 48 months. Visit minispecialoffers.ca. Time saver traffic, it's every 15 minutes, and I'm Michael DiMaggio. Listen live anytime online at newstalk1010.com.
You're listening to Megan Harris on In-Depth Radio News Talk 1010 in conversation with Andy Manahan, who's the Executive Director of RCCAO, and they are an organization that brings together management and labor to push infrastructure improvements in Ontario so that we can bridge the gap, the infrastructure deficit that we have. Now, Andy, you're being very diplomatic in your answers, but I'm wanting you to tell me and tell the listeners what are some of the things that we need to start addressing here in the GTA and across the province if we don't want to have the scenario that you present in your video 50 years down the road.
Well, it has to be a coordinated approach, but let me give you one example that's been talked about
ad nauseum?
Not ad nauseum, but in the Mississauga, and I think in Toronto Council as well, has been saying that, when we do have a storm surge like we did, if someone has a yard, let's say, which is paved over more so with a parking lot, then perhaps that individual should pay more in terms of a water rate than someone who's done something with a more permeable surface that has more green space around the yard. So there's kind of specific measures that people are talking about that might be better. At the local level, people could certainly disconnect their downspouts. They could install low flush toilets so that when the system is getting overloaded, there's less water getting into the system. Don't water your lawns during the day. Use your sprinklers in the evenings, that sort of thing. Just the little things, but they all add up.
Okay, and I guess that I'm just wondering, is there some other jurisdiction where people who have paved over their front yard so that they can have a parking space, are there jurisdictions that they, in such instances, these residents have to pay higher taxes?
I'm not aware of any yet. I do know that there's many municipalities that have become more restrictive in terms of their bylaws about allowing additional parking in the front, and Toronto, I think, is one of those. We used to have all sorts of situations where people, didn't want the vagaries of trying to find a parking spot on their street, so made a request to their local councillor for, parking pad on their front lawn. That has gone by the wayside now. So there's some good examples here in this area where we've taken note of that.
Okay, Andy Manahan, I'm going to say thank you for joining us, and thank you for giving us some fruits for thought in terms of how and what needs to be done going forward. And your website is rccao.com.
Yes, it is.
If listeners want to learn more about what are some of the key areas.
And we have lots of reports that are publicly accessible as well for people to read on infrastructure.
Super. Thank you again.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye for now. So that was Andy Manahan of RCCAO. After the break, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my vacation plans, because I won't be